Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today it's time for us to get into our second episode of what I'm going to be dubbing Summer Scouting Sundays this offseason. This is all for the 2025 NFL Draft. We focused on the wide receiver class last time. Now we're going to be taking a look at edge rushers. So for all the Jaguars fans, which is probably practically 100% of everyone watching, this is going to be a better position to talk about because obviously it's a bigger need, right? Wide receivers pretty locked down. 3 starters are going to be here probably the next 2 years. Very unlikely that's not the case, but this team right now, and I mentioned it in the video I just finished recording. It's like an hour, 30 minutes long, so excuse me if my voice cracks at all, because I've talked a lot today. But in that, like the last video I was recording, I mentioned how the Jaguars do not have a lot of pass rush depth right now. Like, it's Travis Gibson, it's Yasir Abdullah, and that's pretty much it. And I don't know if that's really going to cut it. And so teams rotate guys. They need more than 2 starters in my eyes. And I think it's very much on the table to be looking at another big addition there. And even in the first round, potentially. So all these guys are on the table. This is a position that could definitely be a need. And it's very possible we see one of these players be a pick for Jacksonville next year. And if you're not a Jaguars fan, we'll still going to talk about all these guys and give their general profiles. So it's good information for you as well. So we've got 10 players because we are starting with consensus top prospects. We're not going super deep into this. We're just taking the consensus guys. And we'll start from the bottom of the list. We'll work our way through. So that first guy, the 10th overall prospect I have, not one I expected to be here. But Princely Umanmielen, probably said that wrong. Forgive me. He was unfortunately a very disappointing prospect for me to watch this year. I was expecting a lot, especially given his really good size. Someone I liked last year in the limited time I watched him. He's from Florida as well, so a little bit biased there. Maybe I'm biased now because he left Florida, but I really don't feel that way. He was just kind of disappointing. But getting into just talking about him, his build, he's 6'5", 254. This is ideal size for an outside linebacker. That's more of what he plays. He can move back in coverage. You see a bit of that on film. He is an older prospect, though. He'll be 23 heading into the draft on draft day. He's graded out pretty well on PFF. I do not know if that really is very applicable to his film, though. He does not feel like the same guy when you look at how good the numbers are and how he performs on the field. And maybe he's one I'm missing something on. We'll know, months down the road, but just wasn't crazy exciting. But to talk about the actual positives here, he has great length. He fills it out well. Like I said, he has that ideal size. I gave him an A in that category. He gets quick off the line of scrimmage. So he has some explosion to his game when he wants to have explosion to his game. And one thing to note with him, in my film evaluations, one of the games I watched was against Georgia, and he looked like a completely different player in that game. He was very good. And if he plays like that at Ole Miss, maybe if it's just an issue of him not really wanting to try at Florida and he performs for Ole Miss and is the better player, he's worth more than being what to me is a 4th or 5th round pick. Given he will not go there, he will probably go much higher, but just where I would feel comfortable with him. So it'll be interesting to see if he performs like that guy rather than the one of the other games I watched. And then he's also really good exploiting gaps when he's rushing. He has good vision in that, and occasionally he blows up plays doing that. But unfortunately, it's a much longer list of concerns for me than positives. There's a lot of time in the Florida tape where he's lumbering around. He's kind of slow on the field. He gives up on plays when he thinks he can't get to the quarterback or pursue. So this is not someone who was a high effort guy in Florida. Given that Georgia game I mentioned did look different. He did look like a high effort guy there. So it's possible he plays like that this year. He was also someone, like I said, with him being an outside linebacker, he was used quite a bit in coverage, but I didn't really see the fluidity from him to be that effective in coverage. And as a pass rusher, doesn't really have the arsenal of pass rush moves I'm looking for. I think he's got to do a lot more there. And with the pass rush moves he has, doesn't have really much of a plan. He's often relying on winning with just pure power. So those are some concerns I have. Other things as well. He struggles a lot to use leverage on tackles. He doesn't really know how to take advantage of his size. It's a good thing the size is there, though, right? Because when you get the combination of not knowing how to leverage against players, but you also are smaller, that's where the problem really comes in. And then the final thing with him, it feels like with even though he's good at exploiting gaps, he's often spending too much time just looking for the path of least resistance when getting to the quarterback. I mean, there will be plays where he'll go from rushing around the edge to now he's like running back behind the line of scrimmage. Then he's going through the middle and the quarterback's throwing the ball already, right? He's just not having an impact, but he's just like, he's not that, that willing to engage with blockers, weirdly enough. And so he had a very unfortunate grade from me. Really the best thing he was at other than his size was his athleticism, and the athleticism isn't incredible either. You know, there's concerns there. I think right now, like, he's probably a below average starter in the NFL. And I really worry about how he's going to transition now. Like I said, if he can play like he was against Georgia, it's a different evaluation, very different evaluation. But getting into my summary on him, which we do for all these prospects, I'll read that now. I said Umanmielen was unfortunately among the most disappointing film reviews I had before the season. While he has a nice baseline of physical tools, he was ineffective in using them in the field. He was often lumbering around with a concerning lack of effort on film. Instead of defeating tackles with counter moves, he often chose the path of least resistance, delaying his rushes by seconds. He wasn't comfortable staying engaged with tackles, often bailing after his first move didn't work. And among the most confusing aspects of his film were the glimpses of a completely different player, showing respectable effort and results in big games. While this could be seen as a sign of his potential, I wonder why it wasn't there in other games. He reminds me of a recent prospect from Notre Dame, although Umanmielen has a long way to go to match his urgency. Perhaps the change of scenery could be exactly what he needs, but I'm not willing to personally make that bet. So that player is Isaiah Foskey. I feel like talking about where I get this comp from is they have very similar frames. Foskey was a little bit heavier than him, but similar overall. And the way they move felt very similar as well. And they both try to win with length. They aren't super violent players when they're engaging with blockers. So those were some of the similarities I found in those guys. Now, moving on to our next prospect here. Actually, before I do that, film I reviewed, just to throw that out. This is all 2023 film. I watched Utah, I watched South Carolina, and I watched Georgia. So we'll move on now to our next guy. Another FSU pass rusher coming out this year. Not as good as Jared Verse, but still one I think could have a role in the NFL. And that's Patrick Payton out of FSU, out of Florida State. He is more of a defensive end. I was not able to get his specific age, but he's around 22, I would imagine. He's going to have 4 years of college experience coming out into this class if he chooses to do so. He is 6'5", 239. I did hear something about him being up to 250, but looking at pictures, I didn't really think that was the case, and so I'm probably going to leave it at 239 until I'm proven wrong. And that is a pretty big aspect of his game that I'm a bit concerned about, because he is kind of a light player. But getting into to notes on him, you know, he's got long limbs. He gets a physical advantage from those. I feel like he does a good job of tracking the ball and assisting on tackles. He is a player who gives great effort. He's not someone who's going to give up in pursuit. He's going to try to stay involved. There were even plays where the ball carrier could be 30 yards down the field, and I think there was one where he was the guy making the tackle. He was like the last line of defense somehow, because that's the kind of effort he plays with. He's also, with his size, a very good speed threat around the edge. So tackles who can't move well, he could be a big issue for them. I feel like against the run as well, he does a good job setting the edge, making sure that running backs can't just bounce outside and get massive gains. And then just something small I note with a lot of these prospects. When they're getting their hands up in the air, I like to mention that. I like to mention that they're trying to bat passes. They're trying to make an impact where they can. And Patrick Payton does that, and he's got the arms to do it. He's got very good length. So it's really nice stuff there. But there's, of course, the concerns. This is not a player who's grading out incredibly well. You see most of my grades across the board come around being average. But the concerns, he is an incredibly light player, especially for his frame. Got a lot of length, not a lot of size. It's not a combination I'm personally a huge fan of. He also doesn't have a lot of strength in his hands. He usually needs a great hit to force a tackle and move, or to even bring down a player. So that's a little bit of a concern, is that grip strength. And then he doesn't really get that physical with tackles. He can try to at times, you can see that, but he's very limited because of his size, because he's playing against guys who are 320, 330 pounds. It's a really bad disadvantage for him. And then there's times as well where on his rushes or in run defense, he becomes more of like a prevent defense kind of player rather than being proactive. Like, he's not looking to make the big plays enough. And there's always the balance in that, but I'd like to see Patrick Payton maybe be a little more aggressive with the way he plays. Now, getting into my summary for him, what I said about him was that Payton is a lengthy prospect who must add more size to his frame. While he has the frame to succeed, he lacks ideal hand strength and often can't be physical with tackles when engaging them. In addition, I didn't find many pass rush moves on his film, as he often looks to be simply quicker than his opponent. Payton has great speed and adequate enough hand fighting to win around the edge. While he isn't super physical, Payton stays involved in the play and makes tackles. There are even plays on film where he'll act as the last line of defense. While I don't think he's an impact player right now, it's clear he's trying to be one. If he can bulk up for his final season, we could be in for some exciting results. And that's where that size really does matter, because if he is indeed up to 250, something around there, all of a sudden, Patrick Payton rises really far from me, at least in his grade on size. That's where I want to see him play around. I think he could be a much better player like that. But for now, someone I feel like he's very similar to is an Arizona Cardinals player in Myjai Sanders. Similarities between these guys: they're both tall, lanky pass rushers. They both use their length to their advantage. That's how they beat blockers. They also are guys who are going to get their hands up, bat passes, and they're going to really, in addition to using that length, try to win with speed. And they're both players who show a lot of effort on film. And then final things with him, I have him currently as a middle of the third round prospect. I think you could justify him with that extra size maybe being an early third or a late second, but for now this would be where I feel comfortable with him at. And for the film I reviewed, this is all 2023 once again. I watched LSU, I watched Duke, and I watched Louisville. So with that said, we'll go to my 8th overall prospect in this class at the edge position, and that's Jack Sawyer, who, quite frankly, I think is just going to be a good player at the next level. I don't know if it's going to be great. I don't know if it's going to be a widely recognized name, but I just think he's going to be a good player. Getting into notes on him, he's a defensive end once again, not much of a coverage guy. He's going to be 22 years old at the time of the draft. He has a great frame with a really good size at 6'5", 260. And getting into other things on him, fills out that frame. He is explosive off the line of scrimmage, which is a great thing to see for a player who's 260 pounds. And he's a very good gap penetrator. And that's another thing that's kind of shocking for a guy with his size. He's very good at that, and he is a very high motor player. If you're going to ask, what's the first thing that stands out with Jack Sawyer to remember him, this is someone that you're just not going to see him take plays off. You're not going to see that motor run low. It's always going to be running high. He's always going to be trying to make an impact. The final positive I want to mention with him, plays with very violent hands. He tries to throw a lot at pass protectors, and it's really fun stuff to watch on film. He's someone who you won't get bored watching. Now, there are, of course, concerns too. Mental processing and just overall awareness on the field was something I felt like was a little bit lacking with his film. He can also quite often collapse in on run plays where he will just pretty much collapse the line into the middle, and then he'll leave the outside for running backs to go, and they'll get 5-10 yard gains, get first downs. I want to see him have more I want to see him be a better run defender. I want to see him do a better job of being where he needs to be and completing his assignments there. And then I didn't really see a whole lot of bend from him on film. I don't think he's a super flexible player, which isn't surprising at his size. He's also not a guy who has like a clear wow factor. You see a lot of these grades, like we're talking about, usually just above average. So there's nothing massive that's going to stand out with him other than really just playing with that high motor. And then he is a guy, he has some pass rush moves, but he needs to have a better plan for how he comes at the quarterback and how he comes at tackles. I want to see him do a little more thinking on that, which comes back to maybe some of that mental processing. Now, my summary for Jack Sawyer, I said Sawyer is a relentless edge rusher whose motor never stops running hot. He's quick off the snap, which helps him get gap penetration and disrupt inside runs. When engaging tackles on passing downs, Sawyer plays with violent hands that can help him get off blocks with pure strength. Sawyer easily projects as a really nice rotational edge defender, but I question if he can become much more than that. He's often found oversetting inside on run plays, giving up easy gains around the edge as he abandons his assignment. His overall awareness lacks, and he doesn't plan past the first move. I love the floor that Sawyer presents, but he feels like a prospect where you know what you're getting, and that feels like a nice rotational piece. My comp for him was Jonathan Grenard. My notes for why I gave that comp said both are power rushers. They have relentless motors, very physical players, and both were kind of players you knew what you're going to get with. They had high floors. It was hard to imagine them not having a role in the NFL. It's hard for me to see Jack Sawyer as someone who just does not work out. I think he's still going to have a role on defense. I don't know if it's ever going to be like a bona fide starter, but maybe it will be at some point. And talking about Grenard, like he just got paid $19 million a year by the Vikings. So if Sawyer can live up to that comp, then that's really good for him. And maybe he is one of those guys who gets a good second contract. But of course, like a lot of these comps we use are generally loose. We're trying to use them just to give you an idea of what the player's like, rather than saying, this is Jonathan Grenard. This is the exact same player. It just helps you kind of remember things about him. And then as far as where I think he should go, I think he's an early third round pick, maybe a late second, if you're comfortable with taking him there. But for me, ideally, I'm taking him in the third. And then for the film I watched on Jack Sawyer, I watched all 2023 film. It was Notre Dame, Purdue, and Missouri. So now getting to our next guy, who is one of our first shorter players, although he is a pretty big guy still. It's Ashton Gillotte. I'm going to butcher that last name, to be honest. I didn't look up the pronunciation before this, so God forgive me. But Ashton, he is 6'3", and when you're reported at 6'3" as a pass rusher in college, sometimes it's not even true. Sometimes you're smaller, and so it's really concerning for me when the reported sizes that are usually bigger than what they actually are still too small. So there could be a little bit of a length issue here with Ashton. Now, 275 pounds, he is a big edge rusher. He is probably someone that could kick inside just a little bit if a team wants him to. Getting into my notes on him, the really outstanding part of his game that you're going to see is the power aspect. He's a very physical player. He gets an A from me in that category. He can rip blockers away just from his strong hands. And he is surprisingly fast for his size. He gets a really good athletic score as well. He plays with a high motor. He's a player who's always going to be working his way towards the ball, and he can work his way between the tackles and penetrate the line. Talking a little bit about him reducing inside and trying to get after the quarterback that way. I think he is someone that if teams really want him to, they could probably get him to be a little versatile. Now, concerns here, he seems to just kind of solely rely on shoving people out of the way. There's not really the plan that you want to see. He's a bull in a china shop, is the way he plays, more than maybe a refined edge rusher that has a plan. He's also had a few late hits that show up on film, so he needs to kind of tone that down because he could get penalized in the league, and we've seen plays like that will change the course of a game. It'll keep a drive going, that could be a score, and that could really seal the game. So you do not want those penalties because that's 15 yards. Like, that's pretty bad. So he does need to really watch out for that. And then I want to see him diagnose plays a little bit better. The RPOs specifically were an issue on his film, where he just jump on the wrong guy and end up giving up the play. So those are some of my my notes on him. And what I wrote about Ashton was that he's an impressive athlete given his size of the position. He plays with immense power against blockers. He breaks anchors. He shows the ability to rip off blocks with his hand fighting. He plays with a high motor that often ends up with him being a part of the play. And these characteristics are impressive, but he's also not really among the best at his position because sometimes he doesn't really effectively utilize his strengths, just kind of raw power rather than refined power, rather than knowing what's best to do with it. He's often caught losing track of the ball. He leads to bad plays. Talking once again about RPOs, he can throw in screen passes as well. He's also has fair share of late hits that could get him penalized in the league. And here really the potential is immense with that power profile to his game. I think there's a lot to work with. It wouldn't be shocking if he actually went first round to a team. But for me, I think he's got to be a much smarter player to really get into the conversation of being a first rounder, especially given that he is not a player with ideal length. I think it's very rare you see guys like that go early. So those are my notes on him. My comp for Ashton was Isaiah McGuire, who is a current Browns player. Now, McGuire came out of Mizzou. As far as that comp, they're both shorter, stockier pass rushers. They have smaller hands, but decent arm length. You can see some of that decent arm length in the picture. Both of them are very ferocious players, rely a lot on violence, rely on power, but not really refining it at this point. And both of them have some issues diagnosing plays. So that's where I got that comp from. And then my grade for Ashton, well, I said I think he could be a first rounder. He's not a first rounder for me. I have him as an early third, mainly because of that size and then just the lack of refinement and wondering how he really transitions to the next level. And then my film that I watched on him, all 2023 film, is Pittsburgh, Kentucky, and USC. So now our sixth guy here, and getting nearly halfway through this now, it's someone that I've seen people put as the top edge rusher in this class. And it's kind of hard for me to do it because he's just so out of position where he played. And I hope that the team he's gone to will do a better job of that. But that's Nic Scourton, who's gone to Texas A&M. He is a defensive end who's been forced to play outside linebacker against his will. I would think it would be against his will if he knows what's best for him. He is a young player, though. Like right now, he's 19 years old. He will be still 20 years old at the time of the draft. He's 6'4", 280 pounds. So this is a big guy, which is somewhere where you start to see that Myles Murphy comp come into play with him. But notes on him, he's built into a really nice power rusher mold. He has some pass rush arsenal already to his game, which is really good to see when you're 19 years old. And then he's also someone who's really good at disrupting blocking schemes when he's playing the run. He can blow up those plays. And it's very clear on his film that there's just a lot of untapped potential. Was not used where he should be. But at the same time, just because you have potential doesn't mean anything until you're accomplishing something on the field. That's where it all pays off. And this year for Nic, he's got to do that because he's not been able to yet, because he's just been with a team that I don't think has known how to use him. Now, my concerns with them in this list is a little bit longer just because, well, it's hard to find a ton of positives when you're not getting used in the right position. He was used a lot in 2-point stances. So this is a guy who was standing up on a lot of reps, dropping in a coverage at 280 pounds consistently. And I just don't see that as being his game. I don't think he has a good feel for it. I don't think he's good at covering. It just did not make any sense for what Texas A&M should be doing with their players. And then while he has some pass rush moves, I think he could both expand his arsenal and then use them more often. You know, just having a better plan, having more things you can throw at a blocker. It will definitely help him, especially given how much he's already going to overwhelm players with his power. And then the final thing I wrote as far as concerns was that he does rely on power to win too often. And I feel like he's another player, kind of like Ashton, where he just doesn't understand how to use it effectively. So this is a very raw prospect that could change over the course of this year because he's finally going to get experience in the right position. Cross your fingers. But Scourton, I think there's a lot to work with. Incredibly young prospect, might be the youngest actually I've scouted so far. My summary for him, I said he's a young prospect with many questions looming heading into the year. He was used completely out of position at Purdue, lining up often in a 2-point stance and being used as a coverage linebacker despite weighing an apparent 280 pounds. It makes a lot of sense why he transferred to Texas A&M. And we can only hope he gets the season playing in the right role. Scourton is built like a power rusher and has some pass rush moves already developed, but he needs refinement. He often relied upon his bull rush and was stunted once tackles were able to anchor against him. He needs to put together more of a pass rush plan and to use his hands to his advantage. Unfortunately, Scourton could be limited in the length department, but I see the potential of what could be if he's in the right spot this year. And that's kind of where you get that C+ size. I do knock it down a little bit just because I think 280 is a little big for a player, especially if you mainly should be playing defensive end. And then he's also got some concerns maybe with his arm length, which we're kind of just scouting off of images right now rather than legit measurements. But I went with Myles Murphy for this. Reason why I went with Myles Murphy is pretty simple here. Both are big, lengthy power rushers. They're raw coming out and players who just didn't get developed enough in college. That could change this year, so could be someone I get a different comp on by the time we get to the draft, but that's who I've got for now. And then I've got Nic as another 3rd-round pick. I've got him as an early one. Now, totally would understand if a team wants to take a shot earlier, saying they can develop this guy, but for what he is right now, considering you have to develop him before he's really a good starter, I would probably want to take him in the 3rd round if it was up to me. And then my film reviewed for him, all 2023 film, I watched some actually pretty good opponents for him. We had Ohio State, Michigan, and Illinois. So we're going to start moving into some 2nd-round guys now, and some of these better rushers. One of them coming up is a personal favorite of mine, definitely a my guy. But before that, we've got a very lengthy player, and that's out of Arkansas. That's Landon Jackson. Landon Jackson is a defensive end who is 6'7" and 281 pounds. You don't really see that much. He's 22 years old when he's getting drafted, currently 21. He is a monster as far as size goes, and he fills it out pretty damn well. Great length, and he's someone who gets really good leverage on blockers. When he's engaging them, he prevents the anchor. Really good stuff there. He has a good combination of speed and power as well. He's a player who plays with a very good motor. I also think he's very smart. Some of his film really feels like it shows that to me. And then one of his moves that is very effective on film is his long arm. He will displace tackles with that, keep them from anchoring, and he will push them straight into the quarterback. He's also a player that sets the edge very well against the run, has good integrity against the run, and he's got very strong hand fighting skills. You have very powerful hands. So, I mean, athletic profile and size, like a lot of stuff you like to see. Still, with that said, of course, not necessarily, and getting a concern, is not really the most flexible guy, not a guy who's going to bend a ton, not someone who's crazy explosive. Doesn't have really the arsenal of pass rush moves I'm looking for at this point either. He's got some effective ones, but he's got to add more to his game. Going along with the athleticism talk, he's not someone who has good change of direction skills. He's someone who I think needs to also be able to work off of blocks quicker. Sometimes he just kind of stays engaged, tries to win with power, when he could probably pull a move and get off pretty quick. So I want to see that urgency when he's on blocks. And then, going back to speed here, I don't think he has the ideal speed to win around the edge, especially given that he's a player who doesn't bend that well. So some of my initial thoughts there on Landon Jackson in my summary for him, I wrote that he's a unicorn of a prospect with abnormal length and a good combination of speed and power. Jackson uses these advantages to get leverage on blockers, often going to a long arm to drive back blockers and keep their hands off of him. Jackson shows good football smarts, finding a way to get involved and predict where the play is going. His current attributes give him a good floor with a high ceiling, but he needs more refinement to be considered an impact starter. Jackson has minor limitations from his massive frame, but my top concern is the lack of pass rush moves showing up on film. It's evident that he has some in his arsenal, but he spends too long trying to win with power before attempting a counter move. This prevents him from doing much more than push the pocket, especially since he lacks the speed and bend to get around the edge. Jackson is already a good prospect with exciting film, but he needs to bring it all together to solidify himself into the early portions of day 2. So my comp for him, I went with Sam Hubbard. It was hard to find someone who really fit here, just because Jackson has this crazy length. But these guys are very similar. They are both very smart players. They're high motor players. They're players who fight well with their hands. And really the big limitation for both of them is that flexibility and a little bit of a lack of athleticism. So that's where I got that comp from. I have Jackson as a late second rounder right now. So he is definitely going to be one of the earlier prospects. I think I'm still kind of low on him compared to consensus. And then for the film reviewed, I watched LSU, I watched Ole Miss, and I watched Alabama. So you got some good tackles in there that he's going up against, especially with LSU having two guys who people see as first rounders. And, Alabama, I don't know, I can't remember how much he played against Latham, but Latham's there. And then the other guy, I believe, was a freshman. So, fresh meat at that point. But that's my fifth guy. Now, getting into one of my personal favorites and the last guy before really what I'll call kind of like the top 3 of this class, it's Kaimon Rucker. He just has really, really fun film to watch. And he's a player that you just pray to God like some miraculous growth spurt comes in, because you look at the size. He's an outside linebacker. He's 23 years old, but he's 6'2", 265. This guy is doing everything he can with what he's been given by God. And I just hope for his sake that maybe he's a little taller, because there is so much potential with the way he plays his game. But getting into notes on him, this is a guy who shows the ability to create turnovers. He makes heads up plays. He is an impact player despite his size. He's also a very smart player. He's a very strong prospect as well for being a 6'2" guy. You obviously see that with him being 265 pounds. He also bends really well around the edge, which is one of the good things that at least comes with being a shorter prospect at his position. He's a quick and twitched up edge rusher. I think he sheds blocks very quickly. He's always fast to his next move. He's always got a plan that he's going through. And then he plays with a very high motor. It's a guy who is just going to have nonstop effort on the field, and he has a really good speed power game as well that he's throwing at tackles. So he has a plan to overcome that size and to be able to win these reps. And I really didn't have a whole lot of concerns other than the very obvious, right? He lacks ideal length. Yeah, that's just a fact, and I wish it wasn't that way, but that's the truth here. He's also a player that, his lack of size will show up on film against bigger tackles. Like, probably not someone I'd ideally want to watch against a Kelvin Banks Jr. Now, he also is someone who can't always shed off blocks because of that lack of size. These are just very obvious things, right, that you're going to get with this kind of prospect. But believe me when I say that Kaimon Rucker really does the most that he can with what he's given. And for that reason, he is one of my favorites, and he's someone that I look at and I see a player who could be a very, very good rotational pass rusher. I think he's someone who could come on the field when your starters are gassed and make a big play. That's what's exciting about him. But my summary on him, I wrote that he's an early favorite of mine from this draft class because of the unique challenges he presents to offensive linemen. He finds a way to challenge them. Rucker appears to be short, but he's smart, explosive, and strong. There isn't a play where Rucker isn't playing with a high motor. He's constantly thinking about his next move and throwing an arsenal of counters against blockers. Physicality is a major aspect of his game. There was no matchup more exciting than watching him play against Graham Barton. While it wasn't necessarily in favor of Rucker, he put up an incredible fight against one of the best tackles from this previous class, and another favorite of mine from that class as well. The biggest question about Rucker is whether or not he can overcome his size deficiencies, but I feel confident saying he will. He has everything else I'd look for in an edge defender. And to me, he's just an undersized prospect that I would bet on at the next level. And so my pro comp, I went with a player that was just drafted only a month ago. That's Mohamed Kamara. And my reason for that comp, both were older, well-developed edge rushers that were exciting on film, had a lot of fun watches, but ultimately it just all came down to size. That was the big question with them, and can you believe that they're going to be able to overcome it? That's what hinders him as far as this projection. There'll be people who will put him as a day 3 guy because of that. There'll be people like me who actually believe in him and think he's got enough to succeed and he's going to find a way to do it. And that's just where I stand on him. I think he's a hell of a player and he's going to make it happen at the NFL level. But really fun watch. I encourage you guys, if you want to watch film on him, definitely go watch him play against Duke. That was my final evaluation of him. I also watched, just for the film reviewed, it was all 2023 film. Appalachian State and Minnesota were the other watches I did. But it's just fun watching him go up against a guy like Barton, who's also not that big. He's obviously a little more gifted in length than what Rucker is, but it was a very physical, fun fight because if you watch Barton at all, you know he's a very very explosive player, and he's always trying to kill someone on every play, it feels like. But talking about our next guy, and someone who's really just got to be about the exact opposite as far as physical gifts. You could say that about Landon Jackson as well. But I have Mykel Williams as my third edge rusher, and I think this is a little bit of projection because there were just times on film where I wasn't super excited watching him. But, you know, Mykel Williams has some great size, especially talking about his length. He's 6'5", 265 pounds. He's got a frame that's filled out really well, and his combination of speed and power is really good. He plays both those sides very well. He also is a player who has a lot of experience across the formation. In 2022, he even took snaps inside. He's also a guy who flashes very quick hands. He will occasionally show some really good moves like his long arm, his spin move, and he's a very violent prospect. He will stun blockers at times and be able to overwhelm them. But at the same time, you know, he is a developmental prospect still. he is not a complete player for me at this point. And for him to be a very early first round pick, he's going to have to develop, because for now, this is kind of where he's stuck for me. He does lack an ideal pass rush arsenal. There are times on film as well where he feels like just a guy on Georgia's defense, and that happens a bit too often. He also doesn't break off blocks that easily. Sometimes it just seems like he doesn't know how to. He needs to be getting coached up better, learning more moves, and the pursuit speed is surprisingly lacking at times. He won't be in that situation too much, but when he was, it wasn't great stuff. He also doesn't seem to have great flexibility for his size, and I don't really see him attempt to bend around the edge all that often or win with speed, which, to be fair, is not really his game. He's a power rusher. But didn't see a lot of that, and there's times where he just completely relies on power to beat the blocker. He just wants to win with size, and that's not going to work that often in the NFL. You have to be able to develop your game, because the guys you're going up against are the same prospects who shut you down in college. So it's not good if you can't develop your game. Now, my summary on Mykel Williams, I said that Williams is a physical freak with all the potential to be the best prospect in the class. I'm talking about edge rusher. He's got length for days and fills out his frame well. Williams plays with immense power, often overwhelming blockers and sometimes never giving them a chance with his hand fighting. However, this isn't always the case on film, as Williams too often looks like just another guy on the field. He needs to utilize more pass rush moves and expand his arsenal, and there are times on film when he doesn't know how to shed blocks. While his strength is a huge plus, it also costs him flexibility and prevents him from being a speed threat around the edge. It can be tempting for Williams to continue winning with sheer power given his size, but he needs to further develop his skills to succeed at the next level. My comp for him was actually kind of an easy one here. I went with Jermaine Johnson II. The reasons for that, both are very big pass rushers. They had great length. They were players as well that when they finished their time in college, they were still ascending. They were still developing. Both players also were not super flexible, and they relied a lot on winning with their size advantage. And their pass rush arsenals were generally limited, but were being expanded upon. So, I mean, Jermaine Johnson, I haven't followed him super close since he was drafted, but he's a player who's getting better. I think he's a good player for the Jets, and I could see Mykel Williams having kind of a similar trajectory at the NFL level. Now, I have Mykel Williams as a late first right now. That's where I'd feel comfortable with him. Probably no earlier, though, because there is risk involved with this pick, because it's going to be different when you go from Georgia, maybe playing on a defense that doesn't have as many pieces, depending on where he goes. The film I watched for him, I watched Missouri, I watched Ole Miss, and I watched Florida State. So those are all 2023 games as well. Now, final two here, and we're going to get up into the earlier portions of the first round. First with a guy I have as a middle first rounder, and finally with the prospect who, for me, after evaluating what is currently probably 4 or 5 positions, is my third overall prospect at this point. Will probably finish top 10 at the end of the day. But the first guy, who was a middle of the first round guy, is JT Tuimoloau. He's a defensive end. He's still a young one too, with a lot of experience. He's going to be 22 years old at the time of the draft next year. He's got really nice size. 6'5", 269 pounds. This is a player who is just kind of good at everything, but there's questions about him being great. People have been waiting for that for a long time, especially after his game against Penn State back in what I think was 2022, where he just had a monster performance, and it just hasn't really happened again. But to be fair, I don't think anyone's ever going to replicate that performance. It's a lot to ask for. But Tuimoloau is a great prospect in this class, and probably one of the safer ones for teams to bet on. My positives for him, I say he's got experience doing basically everything you could ask of an edge rusher. I think he's even dropped a little bit in the coverage at the position. But he's not super explosive, but he's got really good speed for a 269-pound edge rusher. He also does a really good job getting his hands into the chest of tackles for his bull rush. So he will get leverage. He will be able to push people back. And he's a strong player that can win those one-on-one battles consistently with his power. Other positives with him, I say he collapses the offensive line inward against inside runs, and he'll work his way into the play. Although I do think he needs to be a little bit more careful about protecting the edge, which we talked about a little bit with Jack Sawyer, his teammate, where he'll kind of collapse in, but it's not always an inside run, and then he gives it up. But Tuimoloau is probably a little more refined with that, but he does have to be careful. He's also really close to being considered a great run defender for me. He's got a lot of potential there. It's just about refining some things. He is a monster against screen passes. You'll see that very quickly if you watch him on film. He's always blowing them up. It's a very consistent thing, and sometimes he even forces the turnover. Did a lot of that in his big game back against Penn State in 2022. And to me, when I watched him last year, over the season, like just going chronologically through every game, it was very clear to me that he was improving at almost everything he was doing. After every game I watched, he was just better and better and better. And I don't think it'll be shocking if he really refines his game this year and ends up being an early first round pick. I think it's possible. I think it's in the cards. I think realistically he's probably middle of the first round, but he's an upward trajectory player. My concerns with him, it's a little bit of that concern about explosion. He's not super explosive or twitchy. Not going to be a guy like that. He also doesn't go to his pass rush arsenal enough. He does need to use that more. He definitely has one. He needs to fight with his hands a bit more as well. He also needs to develop more counter moves. So, that plan after his first move, if it doesn't work, he's got to use that to beat tackles consistently. And I do think, like I said, he can, actually a little bit different than what I said. He can add some moves. He does have some. There's room for improvement, though. Like some of the ones I saw, it's a spin move. He's got a long arm. He's got a bull rush. But there's other things he can throw into his arsenal. So I'd like to see him utilize it better. And then doesn't really have a ton of bend or flexibility. It's not terrible stuff, but not great either. And then finally, I think he could do a better job of sealing the edge against the run, going back to kind of when he collapses inside. It's not always a perfect art to do that, or perfect science. So those are my my notes on him. My summary, I wrote that Tuimoloau is an experienced edge rusher who has consistently improved throughout his career. While he's still far from his ceiling, Tuimoloau has become a top-notch run defender, an effective pass rusher. For clearly being a power rusher, he shows surprising get-off and does well with getting his hands into the chest of offensive tackles. He pushes into the pocket consistently, but needs to use his counter moves more often to finish the play. Against the run, Tuimoloau is always working his way into the play, whether inside or outside the tackles. He has a few limitations, mostly centered around a lack of ideal flexibility, but has a high ceiling as a power rusher. I have confidence he'll take another leap this season. So, my comp for him I actually felt pretty good about. I went with a guy that was kind of looked at as maybe an above average pass rusher back in his class, which would have been 2023, I believe. That's Tuimoloau. He was a second round pick by the Chargers and someone I actually liked a bit in that class, but that's kind of firmly where I had him. And he just felt like a player similar to JT, where he was just kind of good at everything. Not incredible, but just good at everything, had a complete game, and still room for improvement. But, you could ask him to do something. He's going to do it at a pretty good level. Now, my comp, getting into other details about it, the size is nearly identical between these two. JT is a little bit bigger, and then both players were experienced in a lot of different alignments throughout their time in college. So sometimes, like, you see Tuli kick inside. Keeping it simple, though, like I said, both players, they're just good at everything. It seems like they're not incredible, but they're good at everything. And you look at how Tuli's career started. He had a really good first year. Grades might not look that great, but I think he had like 6 or 8 sacks or something crazy. So he's had a good start. He was a good pick for the Chargers. And I think if you're getting JT, that's another guy who's going to be like that. And especially for a team like Jacksonville, you know, if you want to add to your edge room, I think this would be one of the best picks you can make, because you're getting someone, I think, who would be just a phenomenal pairing with what you have, a little bit different of a player, and he's going to get on the field a lot still. So right now, of all the players, I always say I like Kaimon Rucker a lot, but the best one I think would make sense to add that would be available is probably JT. So I've got a middle of the first round grade right now, and the film I watched, I had to watch 2022 film, of course. I had to go back to Penn State. Definitely a game to watch if you're going to watch JT. I also watched in 2023. It was Notre Dame. And it was Missouri. Now, let's get into our final guy here, who I have comped to what was, for a lot of people, the top edge rusher. And for me, he actually was. Although I would probably say now I probably would have put Pearce above him. Not at the time of the draft, but just thinking about more after, I probably would have gone the safe route. James Pearce Jr. I have him comped to Dallas Turner. I'll talk a little bit about that here soon. But James Pearce Jr. is a hell of a football player. He's an outside linebacker. He's a young one, 21 years old at the time of the draft, 20 right now. He's 6'5", 242, so he's a little bit lighter, kind of like Turner was heading into his final year. He is really good at pretty much everything except run defense. Getting into positives with him, though, he's got length for days, phenomenal length. He's an explosive, twitched-up athlete. I can't emphasize enough how lightning fast he is as a player. He will put slower tackles in hell. If you cannot move well, say goodbye to your career. Like, this is not a matchup you want to be going up against. He's also got very active hands. He's great at shedding blocks, especially when he's rushing the passer and keeping tackles from getting their hands on him. He's very good at that, fighting with his hands, having violence in that. He'll throw everything and the kitchen sink at anyone who's between him and the quarterback. He has phenomenal effort on those pass rush situations. He's also got elite speed to power conversion, similar to Dallas Turner. Another thing there that remind me of him a lot. Just, he will displace tackles with that kind of power that he generates, and it makes up for him being 242 pounds right now. He also has the range and athleticism to drop into coverage effectively. He could use a little more experience doing that, but he has the skill set for it. And his arsenal of pass rush moves, he's frequently using them. That's nice stuff to see from a guy who is currently 20 years old. Now, concerns, the first one actually, you could argue is a positive. He has limited experience and he's doing all this. He has only logged 523 snaps heading into his final year. Just in total, 523 snaps. He has room to add strength as well. You definitely want to see him get bigger. I want to see him get up to 250, 255, somewhere around there. Like I said, very similar to what Dallas Turner was dealing with heading into his final year. He also, when he doesn't have leverage or he isn't on the offensive, you can start to see some of the weight issues show up. So he has to be aggressive right now to kind of overcome that and make up for those issues. He also doesn't get off blocks when defending the run. So kind of going back to the same thing. When he is the defender, when he's not the aggressor on a play, technically he's the defender all the time, but when he's not being the aggressor, it's a problem for him. Because when people got their hands on him, he can't get off that well. He's got to kind of control the play to have a shot. So he's got to put on more size to deal with that. He also doesn't have the best pursuit effort. It leaves a little bit something to be desired, especially once they get past the line of scrimmage. And on film, surprisingly, I never saw a ton of bend. I was trying to look for that. I think he was the first edge rusher I watched. And it was one of the first things I was searching for. I just never saw it. Doesn't mean he can't do it, but just never saw him bend. And so I didn't use it as something that dropped his grade, but I kind of wonder. I just never saw him in that situation when I watched him. Now, getting into my summary for him, I wrote that Pearce only needs one play to show you just how special he is. He has elite explosiveness, twitch, hand fighting, and and all these things make life a living hell for pass blockers. He has an arsenal of pass rush moves that he constantly mixes up to keep blockers guessing. Despite his lighter frame, Pearce is able to uproot defenders because of the sheer speed he hits them with, leaving them vulnerable to a final winning move. And he will throw that final winning move, like 100% of the time. In a limited time, Pearce has shown success doing anything from putting his hand in the dirt to dropping into coverage, but he lacks in run defense. While he can shed blocks on the offensive, it's a different story when blockers are gunning for him, which ends with him getting washed out of the play. The solution to this is simple. He needs to bulk up. It reminds me of a familiar face from last year's class, although Pearce comes with even more length. If he can overcome his woes in run defense, he'll undoubtedly solidify himself as a blue chip prospect and have a legitimate chance of being the first player selected. And for me, like before the season starts, I may actually just give him the S grade for the overall. I did end up giving that to another guy at a different position that kind of had some issues with size as well, but it's kind of close here. He's very much top of that A+ range. But as far as my comp to Dallas Turner, I've already mentioned some of the reasons, but to go into detail again about that, they're both very young players when they came out. They're lengthy pass rushers. Major questions loomed about their run defense heading into their final seasons. And the only difference is that Pearce is taller. Dallas Turner came in at, I think he was like 6'2.5". So if Pearce is anywhere close to that number, he's going to have him beat in height. But Turner also had very long arms, so kind of made up for it to where 6'2.5" didn't matter. And then both players, like, speed to power is incredible. And they both have a variety of pass rush moves. They're very well developed. It's shocking me that Pearce is this developed for the limited amount of time he's been out on the field. It's very much crazy. And I think it was kind of the same thing for Turner as far as his snap counts heading into his final year. So once again, another comp there. The grade I have for him, once again, it's an A+, so this is an early first rounder. He's just below my blue chip prospects, but he'll probably make it in there. I'd have a hard time, especially just by the time of the draft, seeing him not be a blue chip prospect. And then film reviewed for him, I watched all 2023 film. I watched Virginia, I watched Missouri, and I watched Iowa. So that's our last guy here. That's my top guy. Right now, I have, as of the time recording this, I've reviewed wide receivers. I've done edge. I have, we'll see the video about later, but I've done the offensive line. So I have all my prospects done there. I'm going to do before the college football season. And I've done about 6 prospects at cornerback. Right now, after doing 40 overall at all those positions, Pearce is my 3rd overall prospect. And Tuimoloau, I was actually 4th on that list too. So these guys are very high for me. These are some of the best players in the class right now. But I'm very excited to watch him. I think he's got tons of potential, but realistically, unless you have a very bad season, you're probably not in range to pick him, because he might just be the 1st overall pick with how good of a player he is, especially with the value of edge. So yeah, those are my thoughts on this edge class heading in. We got 10 prospects we talked about, and I'm sure there's going to be names that enter this list later on that are not really talked about a whole lot right now. But the point of this is to discuss people who are the most likely to probably be around at the end of the year, because when you're summer scouting, there's a lot of names that just don't make it to the final list if you're not careful, because you get guys who, well, a lot of these guys will still probably return to college. That'll happen for some of them. And you get prospects who fall off too, especially the ones that are probably lower on this list that might not have a great season and might not really be draftable. You saw it with, 2 cornerbacks here recently with Keely Ringo. Went from top 5 to early 4th. And then you saw it last year with, not Kevin King. Gosh dang it. It's a Penn State cornerback, Kalen King. Went from being a top 5 pick, possibly, to being 255th. So that stuff happens, but I'm confident a lot of these guys will still be around late in the process. Have plenty of reasons to declare. They should be relevant names later this year and into the early part of next year. So that's all I've got for you guys today. That's our Summer Scouting Sunday. Next week, we'll be doing the offensive line class. So we'll talk about tackles. We'll talk about guards. We'll include anyone who's playing tackle that I think is going to be a guard. I'll still talk about them with the tackles, but I'll make sure to note that because there are some players there's definitely questions about, like there is every year. But that's all for next week. I appreciate you guys watching. Definitely let me know your thoughts on some of your top prospects, people that you like, even if they're not on the list. I've already got people mentioning me before that I've added. There was even a tackle we'll talk about next week that I add to my list because of a comment. So definitely going to listen to you guys and would love to hear your thoughts and what you think on all these prospects. So thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.